From a lump of dirt requested for a dark voodoo ritual, to a single unpitted olive meant to grow into a tree, and a pizza ordered for a homeless stranger, death row final requests can get bizarre. Stay with me, because one entry is an ancient Egyptian royal feast meant to ensure safe passage into the underworld. A bucket of KFC and a pound of strawberries. John Wayne Gacy earns his place on this list because the man behind one of America's most infamous murder cases asked for nothing stranger than a fast food dinner. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy killed 33 young men and boys in Illinois, burying most of them beneath his own home. The public came to call him the killer clown. The strangeness here is the gap between the crime and the plate. A man responsible for 33 documented murders sat down to a meal any child might pick on a birthday. There was no symbolism in it, no protest, and no grand statement. There was only comfort food. On the night of May 10, 1994, Gacy placed an order that sounded almost domestic. He asked for a bucket of original recipe KFC chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, a serving of French fries, and a full pound of fresh strawberries. Guards delivered it without much trouble. The KFC detail carried an irony that reporters noticed. Before his arrest, Gacy had managed several KFC franchises in Iowa, so the bucket of chicken was, in a sense, a return to a job he once held. He was ordering from the world he had built before the killing started. Investigators and journalists have repeated this fact often because it grounds a monstrous figure in something ordinary. The last meal record shows no request for wine, no special preparation, and no unusual item. It reads like a receipt from a strip mall drive-thru rather than a condemned man's final wish. What makes people pause is the volume. A pound of strawberries and a dozen shrimp is a lot of food for one man hours from death. Some read it as appetite, others as denial, and others as a simple wish to taste normal life one last time before the needle. Gacy did not use his final hours to explain himself through food, and that absence is its own message. He offered no last apology tied to the meal, and no gesture toward his victims' families. He ate, and then he was moved toward the execution chamber at Stateville Correctional Center. His actual last words were far from gentle, reportedly telling staff that killing him would not bring back his victims, and using a blunt insult toward the state. The plainness of the meal sits oddly beside the hostility of those words. One was mundane, the other was defiant. This contrast is exactly why his order opens so many strange last meal discussions online. People expect a serial killer's final request to match his crimes. Gacy's did not, and the ordinariness unsettles readers more than any exotic dish could. There is also the matter of what the meal says about the ritual itself. The state fed a man who had denied his victims any final comfort, and it did so by rule, not by mercy. That tension runs through nearly every case on this list, and Gacy's is the cleanest example of it. His execution took roughly 18 minutes after a clog in the lethal injection line, a delay that drew its own coverage. The chicken and strawberries were long gone by then. What remained was the image of a clown killer whose last taste of the world was a drive-through bucket. If Gacy shows how an ordinary meal can feel disturbing next to a terrible crime, the next man proves the opposite extreme. He killed more people in a single morning than Gacy did in 6 years, yet what he asked to eat was smaller, simpler, and somehow even colder. 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. Timothy McVeigh belongs on this list because the deadliest domestic terrorist in United States history asked for one of the smallest meals on it. On April 19, 1995, McVeigh detonated a truck bomb outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, including 19 children. The strangeness is the scale mismatch. A man who took 168 lives requested only 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. No entree, no drink, no side. For the architect of mass murder, the final order was a dessert a child might choose on a summer afternoon. McVeigh was held at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he was executed by lethal injection on June 11, 2001. He was the first federal inmate put to death in 38 years, which meant his every choice drew national attention, including the ice cream. Journalists covering the execution seized on the detail because it clashed so hard with his image. McVeigh had presented himself as a hardened soldier at war with the government, quoting poetry about being the captain of his soul. Then he asked for 2 pints of green ice cream. The choice invited endless reading. Some saw childishness, a man reverting to something plain and sweet at the end. Others saw control, a final refusal to perform or grovel. A minimalist request gave the press nothing dramatic to photograph, which may have been the point. There was no reported complaint, no special brand demand, and no ritual attached. He ate the ice cream in his cell hours before he died. The simplicity stands out precisely because everyone expected the man behind such carnage to want something larger or louder. McVeigh's silence around the meal matched his broader final posture. He issued no spoken last statement, instead handing over a handwritten copy of the poem Invictus. The dessert and the poem together formed his exit, one soft and cold, the other rigid and proud. For the families watching, some in person and many by closed-circuit feed, the ice cream detail was almost offensive in its lightness. A man who had shattered their city treated his last meal like an afterthought, ordering something you might grab from a corner store. That reaction is common in these cases. The public wants the meal to carry weight equal to the crime. When it does not, as with McVeigh's 2 green pints, the ordinariness becomes the story, and the case circulates for years as an example of eerie understatement. There is a practical footnote too. Federal facilities are less generous with special requests than some states, so McVeigh's simple order also fit the rules he was under. He was not choosing from a wide menu, he was choosing something easy to grant. Still, ice cream was a want, not a necessity, and he asked for it knowingly. In a life he had defined by rigid ideology and violence, the final human detail was a preference for mint and chocolate. It is a strange, small window into a man most people would rather not humanize. If McVeigh used a tiny order to say nothing at all, the next man used a modest meal to say far too much. His complaint was not about ice cream, but about pasta, and he made sure the entire press corps heard exactly what went wrong on his plate. SpaghettiOs, not spaghetti. Thomas J. Grasso makes this list, because his strangeness lies not in what he ordered, but in how he reacted when the kitchen got it wrong. Grasso was convicted of strangling an 87-year-old woman with a string of Christmas lights in 1990, one of 2 elderly victims tied to his crimes. Ahead of his execution, Grasso requested a large and specific spread. He asked for 2 dozen steamed mussels, 2 dozen steamed clams, a double cheeseburger, 6 barbecue ribs, 2 strawberry milkshakes, a tin of SpaghettiOs with meatballs, half a pumpkin pie, and strawberries with cream. The kitchen delivered nearly all of it, but made one substitution. Instead of canned SpaghettiOs with meatballs, staff served plain spaghetti. To most people, the swap would be trivial. To Grasso, hours from death, it was a genuine grievance he refused to let pass. Grasso was executed by lethal injection on March 20, 1995, and he used part of his final statement to address the mistake directly. His reported last words have become one of the most quoted lines in the entire history of last meals, precisely because of how petty they sound. He said, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs, I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." A man at the edge of execution chose to spend his last recorded words on a canned pasta complaint, and he made the media his witness. The statement stunned reporters and has circulated ever since. It captures a strange truth about final moments. People do not always rise to solemnity. Sometimes they fixate on the small, concrete thing in front of them, and for Grasso that thing was the wrong bowl of pasta. The detail lingers because it is so human and so absurd at once. Facing death, Grasso did not reflect on his victims or his fate. He reflected on a kitchen error, and he wanted it on the record, as if correcting the meal could correct something larger. Some read the complaint as a man clinging to the one thing he could still control. When everything else was decided, the contents of his last plate were the final territory left to defend. The SpaghettiOs became a stand-in for agency in a process that had stripped it away. Others simply find it darkly funny, and the line resurfaces constantly in online lists of strange last meals. It has outlived the details of his crimes for many readers, who remember the pasta complaint long after forgetting the names involved. The Grasso case also exposes how fragile the last meal ritual can be. A single substitution turned a granted request into a grievance, and it happened because these meals passed through ordinary prison kitchens with ordinary limits. There was no malice, only a swap a condemned man could not accept. His fixation raises a question that runs through this whole countdown. Why do these final choices matter so much to the people making them when the outcome will not change? For Grasso, the answer seemed to be that the meal was the last thing that was truly his. From here, the list leaves the world of complaints and enters the world of refusals. The next figure did not argue about her order or demand anything at all. She turned the ritual down almost entirely, asking for a single cup of something and nothing more. Just a cup of coffee. Aileen Wuornos qualifies as strange for the opposite reason to the men before her. Where they ordered elaborate spreads, she rejected the ritual almost entirely, and that refusal became its own kind of statement from one of America's most infamous women. Wuornos was convicted of killing 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990, shooting them along the highways where she worked as a sex worker. She claimed the killings were self-defense, a claim that fueled films, documentaries, and endless debate about who she really was. When her execution approached in October 2002, the state offered the customary special meal. Wuornos essentially waved it away. Rather than a feast or a symbolic dish, she reportedly asked only for a cup of coffee, saying she was already full from an earlier snack. That small detail says a great deal. A woman hours from death chose a hot drink over a final banquet, treating the moment less as a ceremony and more as an ordinary afternoon. The coffee was familiar, plain, and entirely unremarkable, which is exactly what made it linger. Some observers read the choice as exhaustion. By the end, Wuornos had spent years insisting she wanted to die, dismissing appeals and lashing out at the courts. A cup of coffee fit a woman who had stopped performing for anyone and simply wanted the process finished. Others saw defiance in the refusal. The last meal is offered as a small mercy, a final comfort from the state, and by declining it, Wuornos denied that mercy any power over her. She would not let the ritual soften what was about to happen. Her final words carried that same strange energy, referencing sailing away with the rock and Jesus, and promising she would be back. The mix of religious imagery and menace unsettled the witnesses, and it framed the coffee as part of a larger rejection of ordinary human endings. The simplicity of her request has kept it in circulation among people who study these cases. In a genre dominated by excess and symbolism, a woman who wanted nothing but coffee stands out sharply, precisely because she asked for almost nothing at all. There is also the shadow of her mental state. Questions about Wuornos' competency followed her to the end, and some wonder whether the flat, minimal request reflected a mind that had simply detached from the significance of the moment entirely. Whatever the cause, the coffee became shorthand for her whole final posture. Unbothered, unrepentant in the eyes of many, and unwilling to play the part the ritual expected. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, one of only a handful of women put to death in modern America. The case forces a hard question about these meals. If the tradition is meant to grant dignity, what does it mean when the condemned refuses it outright? Wuornos suggests the refusal can be as loud as any lavish order, a final act of control over a life the state was ending. The next entry swings the mood again, trading a bleak cup of coffee for a bag of something bright and childish. Where Wuornos wanted almost nothing, the next man asked for a fistful of candy, and the choice was stranger and sweeter than anyone expected. Gerald Lee Mitchell lands on this list for a request that sounds like it belongs in a schoolyard, not an execution chamber. Convicted of a double murder in Texas, Mitchell faced the needle with a want that was almost impossibly simple and undeniably strange. For his final meal, Mitchell asked for a bag of assorted Jolly Ranchers. Not a steak, not a burger, not a symbolic single item with hidden meaning. He wanted hard fruit candy, the kind sold at gas stations and handed out on Halloween and nothing else. The choice fits the Strangest label because it collapses the distance between a condemned adult and a small child. There is no clearer image of misplaced innocence than a man on death row, unwrapping colorful candies as his final taste of the living world. Reporters and researchers have puzzled over what Mitchell meant by it. Jolly Ranchers carry no obvious symbolism, no religious weight, and no political message. They are simply sweet, cheap, and nostalgic, the sort of treat tied to childhood rather than to a grown man's last hours. One reading is comfort. Faced with the machinery of execution, Mitchell may have reached for the simplest pleasure he could name, a flavor that pulled him back to a time before prison, before the crime, before any of it. The candy was an escape hatch to a smaller world. Another reading is detachment, a request this minor can signal a man who has stopped treating the meal as meaningful, choosing something trivial almost as a shrug. Either way, the bag of candy became the detail everyone remembered about his final day. Mitchell was a teenager at the time of his crimes, which sharpens the strangeness of the candy. He had grown into adulthood on death row, and yet his final want reached backward toward the child he had been before the murders that put him there. The image is hard to shake. guards handing a grown man a bag of Jolly Ranchers. And that man selecting flavors one by one is both mundane and deeply unsettling. It strips the execution of its gravity and replaces it with something small and sad. That jarring softness is why the case appears so often in collections of unusual last meals. Among the feasts and the symbols, a simple bag of candy reads as one of the strangest choices of all, because it refuses to take the moment seriously. There is a quiet cruelty in how ordinary it is. Candy is meant for celebration, for reward, for kindness between people. To see it appear as a final meal on death row twists that meaning into something bleak. A sweetness placed at the doorway of death. Mitchell was executed by lethal injection on October 22, 2001. Whatever he intended, the Jolly Ranchers became his lasting footnote, a reminder that the condemned do not always reach for grandeur. Sometimes they reach for the smallest, brightest thing within grasp. If Mitchell's candy pulled the mood toward childhood, the next man dragged it back toward the mundane in a different way. His last meal looked less like a final wish and more like a raid on a nearly empty refrigerator. And that ordinariness is exactly what makes it strange. Andrew Lackey earns his spot through sheer anticlimax. His final meal was so plain, so oddly assembled, that it reads like whatever a person might throw together at midnight when the cupboards are bare, which is a strange note to end a life on. Lackey was convicted in Alabama of murdering an 80-year-old World War II veteran during a robbery, a crime that targeted a vulnerable elderly man in his own home. For his execution in 2013, the state allowed him a special request, and what he chose surprised observers with its blandness. He asked for turkey bologna, French fries, and a grilled cheese sandwich. The combination has no theme and no indulgence. It pairs a cold cut usually eaten for economy with two simple sides, forming what many described as an odd pairing or a fridge-raid meal. The strangeness here is the lack of ambition. Given a rare chance to eat anything within reason, Lackey did not reach for steak, seafood, or a childhood favorite. He chose turkey bologna, one of the least celebratory foods imaginable, alongside a sandwich most people make without thinking. Some read the choice as a sign of a modest, even institutionalized palate. After years inside, a man's sense of a treat can shrink, and turkey bologna with grilled cheese may have genuinely felt like a decent meal to Lackey rather than a compromise. Others see something sadder in it. The meal's ordinariness suggests a man who either did not care much about the ritual or could not imagine wanting more. There is no joy in the order, only a flat, functional list of foods to fill a stomach. The pairing of turkey bologna and grilled cheese specifically struck reporters as mismatched. One is a sliced lunch meat, the other a warm sandwich. And together with fries, they form a plate with no center, no main event, just three plain items sharing space. That absence of a centerpiece is what makes it memorable. Most last meals, even simple ones, have a focus, a single dish the person clearly wanted. Lackey's had none, which left observers with the sense of a meal assembled almost at random from a short list. In the broader landscape of these cases, Lackey represents the mundane extreme. Where others chose feasts or symbols, he chose the culinary equivalent of a shrug. And that very flatness is why his order gets pulled into lists of strange final requests. The contrast with his crime deepens the strangeness. He had killed an elderly veteran, a man who had survived a world war, and his own exit from the world was marked by bologna and fries. The smallness of the meal sits uneasily beside the seriousness of what he had done. Lackey was executed by lethal injection in July 2013, his plain plate long behind him. He left no famous last words tied to the food and no explanation for the odd combination. The meal simply was what it was, unremarkable, unbalanced, and quietly strange. The next man's request moved in the opposite emotional direction. Instead of a random assembly of leftovers, he asked for something meant for joy and celebration, a food tied to a specific happy occasion that was not actually happening. He wanted a birthday cake, though it was not his birthday. David Leon Woods makes the list for a request soaked in poignancy rather than shock. His final choice was not violent, defiant, or gross. It was tender in a way that unsettles people, because he asked to celebrate an occasion that was not real. Woods was convicted in Indiana of murdering a man during a robbery when Woods was still a teenager, then spending nearly 2 decades on death row before his execution. Over those years, he grew from a young man into a middle-aged one inside a cell, waiting. For his last meal, Woods requested a birthday cake, despite the fact that it was not his birthday. The strangeness is not in the food itself, but in the occasion it invokes. A celebration of life requested on the day he was set to die. The choice reads as a man reaching for a memory of normal joy. Birthday cake is tied to childhood parties, to being sung to candles and wishes. In asking for one, Woods seemed to want a single taste of the ordinary happiness that his life had long since lost. Some interpret it as mourning. A birthday marks another year of life, and by requesting a birthday cake at the end, Woods may have been quietly grieving all the years he would not get, staging one last small celebration for a future that would never arrive. Others see a simpler longing. After so long inside, the cake stood in for everything warm and human that prison had stripped away. It was not about a date on a calendar, but about feeling, for a moment, like a person worth celebrating. The detail is gentle enough that it disarms even people who have no sympathy for him. A birthday cake carries no threat and no protest. It is the food of children and families, and to see it requested on death row rearranges the usual image of a condemned killer. That is exactly what makes it strange in this company. Surrounded by feasts, refusals, and symbols, Woods's cake stands out for its aching ordinariness. It wants nothing dramatic. It wants to pretend, for the length of a slice, that the day is something other than an execution. The request has drawn quiet commentary in discussions of these meals, where readers debate whether it was calculated for sympathy or genuinely heartfelt. Most land on the latter, finding it too small and too specific to be a performance. There is also a darker echo in it. Birthdays celebrate the beginning of a life, and Woods asked for that symbol at the end of his. The cake sat at both ends of existence at once, marking a birth that had led, decades later, to this room and this needle. Woods was executed by lethal injection in May 2007. The cake did not change his fate or soften his crime, but it left an impression that has outlasted the details of the case for many who read about it. A final wish for a party that could never be. The next entry trades sentiment for oddity of a very different kind. Instead of a symbolic sweet, one man's meal became memorable for a single humble vegetable that appeared in a quantity nobody could quite explain, turning an ordinary plate into a genuine curiosity, a plate heavy on radishes. Steven Anderson makes this countdown not for a grand gesture, but for a peculiar detail buried inside an otherwise unremarkable meal. His final request would be forgettable, if not for one strange emphasis that turned a plain plate into a lasting curiosity. Anderson's last meal centered on ordinary comfort food. Vegetables, a slice of peach pie, and a grilled cheese sandwich. On its own, that order is mild and homey, the kind of meal that would never make a list of the strangest requests on death row. What sets it apart is the heavy inclusion of radishes. Among the soft, familiar items sat an unusual quantity of one sharp, peppery root vegetable, a choice so specific and so odd that it became the defining feature of his final meal. Radishes are not a typical craving. They are crunchy, bitter, and usually a garnish rather than a main attraction. To request them in volume, alongside pie and a grilled cheese, is the culinary equivalent of underlining a word nobody expected to see, and it puzzled everyone who noticed. The strangeness lies in the specificity. A man can ask for steak or ice cream and be understood at once, but an emphasis on radishes resists easy explanation. There is no obvious symbolism, no cultural shorthand, only a personal preference that Anderson took to the very end. Some suspect it was simply a food he genuinely loved, a taste that meant something to him that outsiders will never decode. The quirky volume of a single item suggests a private memory or habit, a flavor tied to his own history rather than to any grand statement. That privacy is part of what makes the request haunting. Unlike a symbolic olive or a protest for world peace, radishes offer no message to interpret. They simply point to a man with his own quiet tastes, ordering the food he wanted without concern for how it would read. The mundane surroundings deepen the effect. Peach pie and grilled cheese are the definition of ordinary, and the radishes sit among them like an unexplained accent. The plate becomes a small mystery, an everyday meal with one detail that refuses to fit the pattern. In collections of unusual final orders, Anderson's radish-heavy plate stands as a reminder that strange does not always mean shocking. Sometimes it means a single, oddly specific choice that lodges in the memory precisely because it is so hard to explain or justify. There is a strange dignity in the ordinariness too. Anderson did not use his meal to make a scene or send a message. He ate what he liked, radishes and all, treating the ritual as a personal matter rather than a public performance for the record. The result is a case that lingers quietly. People remember the radishes long after forgetting the rest, drawn to the human oddity of a man whose last culinary wish included a pile of a vegetable most people push to the side of the plate. From a plate defined by one small vegetable, the list now swings hard toward excess. The next man did not underline a single item. He ordered enough food to feed a small gathering, assembling one of the largest documented last meals in the entire history of American executions. Peter J. Menial earns his place through sheer volume. If most strange last meals stand out for what they symbolize or refuse, Menial stands out for its staggering size, a final order that reads more like a party menu than a single man's dinner. Menial was convicted in Texas of a robbery murder, and when his execution neared, he did not hold back. His documented request was one of the most enormous in the record, a spread so large it strains belief that any one person could have eaten even a fraction of it. He asked for 20 beef tacos, 20 beef enchiladas, 2 double cheeseburgers, a jalapeno pizza, fried chicken, spaghetti, fruit cake, half a chocolate cake, half a vanilla cake, several ice creams, and multiple sodas and juices. It was a feast built for a crowd, ordered by one man. The sheer scale is the point. 20 tacos and 20 enchiladas alone would overwhelm most people, and Menial piled burgers, pizza, chicken, and pasta on top, then finished with 3 separate cakes and a spread of ice cream. The order reads like a dare rather than a meal. Some see it as defiance dressed as appetite. Faced with death, Menial demanded an absurd abundance, as if to test the limits of what the state would provide, or to seize one final excess before the end. The challenge-style meal became a statement of pure want. Others read it as impossible by design. No one expected him to finish it, and he almost certainly did not. The order may have been less about eating and more about the gesture, a final flex of desire in a place where he controlled almost nothing else. Meals like Menial's are the ones that fuel public anger about the tradition. When a condemned man orders a banquet fit for a dozen people, critics point to the waste and the cost, asking why a killer should command such abundance in his final hours. The mountain of food also raises the same question that shadows the entire list. Why order what cannot be eats? For Menial, the answer seems tied to the gesture itself, the act of asking for everything as a way of refusing to go quietly or modestly into the chamber. In the archive of extreme last meals, Menial's order sits near the very top for size, a benchmark against which other feasts are measured. It is remembered not for any single dish, but for the overwhelming totality of the request. There is something almost theatrical in the excess. 20 of one item, 20 of another, halves of multiple cakes stacked together. The numbers read like a script designed to shock, whether or not that was Menial's intent when he wrote them down. Whatever drove it, the meal became his signature. Menial was executed by lethal injection, and the vast unfinished spread outlived him as a symbol of the tradition's strangest excess, a reminder of how far a final request can stretch when limits are loose. The next case leaves American prisons entirely and enters one of the most watched executions in modern history. Instead of a mountain of food, one of the world's most notorious killers requested almost nothing special at all, a plainness made stranger by the enormity of his crimes. Only tomatoes. Ajmal Kasab shifts this list onto the world stage, and his strangeness comes from restraint rather than excess. As one of the perpetrators of a mass terror attack, his final meal was expected to be a footnote to a huge story, yet its very smallness became notable. Kasab was the lone gunman captured alive after the 2008 Mumbai attacks, a coordinated assault that killed more than 160 people across the Indian city. Convicted of terrorism and murder, he was held under intense security until his execution in November 2012. Reports on his final meal vary, but the consistent thread is minimalism. He reportedly received or requested only tomatoes alongside regular jail food, or declined anything special at all, depending on the source. In a case of enormous scale, the meal was strikingly small. The strangeness here is partly cultural and partly circumstantial. India does not run its executions with the elaborate last last meal tradition, common in parts of the United States. So Kassab's options were limited to standard prison fare rather than a menu of special requests. Within those limits, the mention of tomatoes stands out. It is such a plain, humble item that it barely registers as a request at all. And yet it attached itself to one of the most infamous names in modern terrorism, giving the case an oddly domestic footnote. The uncertainty in the sources adds to the mystery. Some accounts say he asked for nothing, others mention the tomatoes. A few suggest he simply ate what the jail provided. The blurred record leaves a strange gap where a dramatic final wish might have been. That ambiguity is itself revealing. In high-profile American cases, the last meal is documented in careful detail, almost ritualized for the press. In Kassab's case, the state controlled the narrative tightly, and the meal became a minor, contested detail rather than a headline. The contrast with the scale of his crime is jarring. A man tied to the deaths of scores of people, left behind no lavish order, no symbolic gesture, no memorable last meal quote. There was only regular jail food and perhaps some tomatoes. A quiet exit for a loud atrocity. For many observers, that quietness felt appropriate. Denying Kassab any special treatment fit a case defined by mass death, and the absence of a grand final meal underscored that he would receive no ceremony, no indulgence, and no platform on his way out. The case also highlights how differently nations handle the condemned. Where some American states once granted feasts, India offered routine and restriction. Kassab's plain plate was not an accident, but a reflection of a system that saw no reason to mark his final hours with generosity. He was hanged in secret at Yerwada Central Jail on November 21, 2012. The details of his final day kept tightly held. The tomatoes, if they were there at all, became the small, strange remnant of an otherwise clinical and closely guarded execution. The next figure also belongs to history's darkest chapters, and he too kept his final meal modest. But where Kassab left behind confusion, this man left behind a precise and chilling record, choosing a single indulgence that felt disturbingly ordinary, given the scale of what he had orchestrated. Adolf Eichmann stands among the most historically weighted names on this list, and his final meal is strange for how normal it was. A chief architect of genocide spent his last hours, not with a symbolic feast, but with routine food and a bottle of wine. Eichmann was a senior organizer of the Holocaust, responsible for coordinating the deportation of millions of Jews to ghettos and death camps. Captured in Argentina and tried in Israel, he was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death, the only civil execution in Israel's history. For his final meal, Eichmann declined any special preparation. He ate his usual fare of bread, cheese, olives, and tea, then requested a bottle of Carmel red wine, an Israeli vintage. He reportedly drank about half of it before he was led to the gallows. The strangeness lies in the blend of the routine and the indulgent. A man who had helped engineer mass murder asked for nothing exotic, only his ordinary prison food and half a bottle of local wine. There was no drama in the order, which makes it all the more chilling. The choice of an Israeli wine has struck many as darkly ironic. Eichmann, condemned by the Jewish state for crimes against the Jewish people, spent part of his final hour drinking a wine produced in that very land, a detail that observers have never quite been able to ignore. Some read the modest meal as composure, a man determined to face death without theatrics. Others read it as detachment, the same bureaucratic calm that had defined his role in the genocide, now applied to his own end. The wine was his single, telling concession to appetite. That calm is precisely what disturbs people. Eichmann did not rage, weep, or beg through his final meal. He ate bread and cheese, sipped wine, and prepared to die with the flat orderliness that had made him so effective and so monstrous in his official duties. The refusal of anything special also reads as a kind of statement. By keeping his last meal routine, Eichmann denied it any significance, treating his execution as a procedure rather than a moment. The half-finished bottle became the only trace of a personal want. Historians and writers have returned to the detail, often because it humanizes without excusing. The image of a genocidal planner drinking wine from his cell forces a confrontation with the ordinariness of the men behind extraordinary evil, a theme that has haunted accounts of his trial. The half-drunk bottle carries its own weight. He did not finish the wine, leaving part of it behind as he walked to the gallows just after midnight on May 31, 1962. That unfinished glass is a small, strange artifact of a man at the edge of accountability. Eichmann was hanged, cremated, and his ashes scattered at sea beyond Israeli waters. A deliberate erasure meant to leave no grave and no shrine. The plain meal and the shared national wine remain among the few personal details preserved from his final night. The next case brings the list back to America and toward something almost playful by comparison. One condemned man paired a rich final meal with an unusual entertainment request, asking for hours of one specific film saga before facing one of the rarest execution methods still in use. Ronnie Lee Gardner earns his place for combining a lavish meal with a request that had nothing to do with food at all. His final wish stretched beyond the plate into the realm of entertainment, and it ended in one of the most dramatic executions in modern America. Gardner was convicted in Utah of a murder committed during an attempted courthouse escape when he shot an attorney while trying to flee. His long criminal history and the violent nature of his crimes kept him on death row for decades before his case reached its end. For his last days, Gardner requested steak and lobster tail, a rich pairing on its own. But he added something unusual: permission to watch the entire Lord of the Rings film trilogy. The state allowed the marathon viewing in the days before his death. The strangeness is in the pairing of appetites. Gardner wanted a fine meal and roughly 9 hours of fantasy cinema, treating his final stretch of life as a chance to feast and to lose himself in an epic story about a long journey toward an inevitable end. The film choice invited endless interpretation. The Lord of the Rings follows characters marching knowingly toward death and sacrifice, and some saw a grim resonance in a condemned man choosing that saga specifically as the last story he would ever watch from his cell. Others read it more simply as escape. Faced with the countdown to his execution, Gardner filled the hours with an immersive world far removed from prison, a long cinematic detour that let him spend his final days somewhere other than reality. What makes Gardner's case especially striking is how his execution ended. He chose to die not by lethal injection, but by firing squad, a method Utah still permitted for inmates sentenced under older rules, and one that had become extremely rare in the United States. On June 18, 2010, Gardner was strapped to a chair with a target pinned over his heart, and a team of marksmen fired. The archaic, violent method turned his execution into a national spectacle, a stark throwback in an era dominated by chemical injection. The contrast between his final days and his final moment is jarring. He spent his last hours with steak, lobster, and hours of fantasy film, then faced a row of rifles. Few cases on this list swing so sharply between indulgence and brutality. That swing is exactly why his story endures. The Lobster and the film trilogy make him seem almost relatable, a man savoring comfort and story at the end. The firing squad shatters that image, dragging the case back into the harsh reality of state killing. Gardner's combined request also stretched the definition of a last meal beyond food. By folding entertainment into his final wishes, he expanded what the condemned might ask for, and the state's decision to grant the viewing set his case apart from nearly every other on this countdown. The next man rejected the whole idea of a personal last request in a way that turned his execution into a global controversy. He refused a special meal entirely, and his reason for doing so pointed at a doubt that shadowed his conviction until the very end. Troy Davis makes this list not for what he ate, but for what he refused, and for the reason behind that refusal. His rejection of a final meal became a statement of defiance and doubt that drew attention from around the world. Davis was convicted of murdering a police officer in Georgia in 1989, but his case became a lightning rod for the anti-death penalty movement. Several witnesses later recanted their testimony, and no physical evidence tied him firmly to the crime, fueling a global campaign proclaiming his possible innocence. When his execution finally arrived after years of appeals, Davis declined a special last meal. According to accounts, he refused the offer, reportedly stating that it would not be his last meal, a phrase that carried the weight of his insistence on innocence. That refusal reframed the entire ritual. Where others treated the last meal as a final comfort or a chance for a statement through food, Davis rejected the premise itself. To accept the meal would be to accept the finality of a verdict he never stopped contesting. His words turned the moment into an act of resistance. By declining the meal and questioning whether it was truly his last, Davis refused to play the role the process assigned him. He would not sit down to a condemned man's dinner as if the outcome were just. The international attention on his case magnified every detail. Hundreds of thousands had signed petitions, and figures from around the globe had called for clemency. So his final choices, including the refused meal, were watched and reported with unusual intensity. The context of doubt gives the refusal its power. If Davis was innocent, as many believed, then a last meal would be an obscene formality, a small kindness offered by a system about to make an irreversible mistake. Declining it was a way to reject that hollow gesture. Even for those convinced of his guilt, the refusal stood out. It was calm, deliberate, and pointed, using the absence of a meal to say what a lavish order never could. Davis made his statement by taking nothing, letting the empty tray speak for him. The scene at his execution was charged with protest. Crowds gathered outside the prison. Appeals flew until the final hours, and the sense of unresolved doubt hung over everything. Against that backdrop, the refused meal became one more symbol of a deeply contested end. Davis was executed by lethal injection on September 21, 2011, the same day that another man on this list met his end in Texas. His final words maintained his innocence and urged those present to keep searching for the truth about the crime. The refused meal endures as part of his legacy for critics of capital punishment. It captured in a single act the argument that the system can proceed with certainty toward a death that the facts do not support, and that no final courtesy can redeem that. The next man also turned away from food, but he replaced it with something far larger and more abstract. Rather than declining out of doubts, he used his final request to ask for something no prison kitchen could ever deliver, aiming his last wish at the whole world. Odell Barnes earns his place for transforming the last meal into a plea rather than a plate. Instead of asking for food, he asked for a concept, using his final request to reach beyond his own hunger toward something impossibly vast. Barnes was convicted in Texas of capital murder tied to a robbery, and his case, like several on this list, carried claims of contested evidence and doubts about his guilt raised by his supporters. Those doubts framed the way many read his unusual final request. When offered a last meal, Barnes reportedly asked for justice, equality, and world peace. Prison officials, of course, could not serve such a thing on a tray. The request was impossible to fulfill by design, and that impossibility was the entire point. The strangeness is philosophical. Barnes took a ritual built around physical appetite and answered it with an abstraction, refusing to reduce his final moment to steak or candy. He aimed his last wish at the structures he blamed for his fate, not at his own stomach. The choice reads as protest. By asking for justice and equality, Barnes implicitly indicted a system he believed had failed him, using the one platform left to him to make a statement about fairness rather than to satisfy a craving before death. It also reads as a final assertion of values. Facing execution, Barnes chose to be remembered wanting something larger than himself, a gesture toward ideals rather than an indulgence. The request placed principle above appetite in his last recorded act. The impossibility of granting it gave the request its sting. Officials had to acknowledge that they could not provide what he asked, an admission that quietly underlined his message. The state could take his life, but could not deliver the justice and peace he named. For his supporters, the request confirmed the man they believed him to be, someone who framed his death in terms of a broken system rather than personal grievance. It fit a narrative of a wrongly condemned man using his last words to speak for others. For skeptics, it was a calculated bid for sympathy, a way to cast himself as a martyr regardless of the facts of his case. Either way, the request achieved its aim of being remembered, standing apart from the food orders that surround it on this list. Barnes' choice belongs to a small tradition of symbolic refusals, where the condemned reject the personal comfort of a meal in favor of a message. In that company, asking for world peace is among the most sweeping, a final wish scaled to the entire planet. He was executed by lethal injection on March 1, 2000, his impossible request unfulfilled by definition. What remained was the image of a man who offered anything within reason to eat, instead asked for the things no reason or kitchen could ever provide. The next man also refused to keep his final meal for himself, but his reason had nothing to do with protest against the system. Instead of demanding an abstraction, he tried to turn his last request into an act of charity, asking that the food go to someone who truly needed it. Philip Workman earns his place for turning his final meal into an act of generosity rather than indulgence, a gesture so unexpected that it drew national attention and inspired imitation even after officials refused to carry it out. Workman was convicted of murdering a police officer during a robbery at a Memphis restaurant in 1981, a shooting that occurred in the chaos after an armed holdup. His case carried its own disputes about the ballistics and the circumstances, but the conviction stood through years of appeals. When his execution neared, Workman declined a personal last meal. Instead, he asked that a vegetarian pizza be given to a homeless person near the prison. He wanted his final request to feed someone in need rather than himself, a striking inversion of the usual ritual. The strangeness is in the selflessness. In a tradition built entirely around a condemned person's own desires, Workman redirected his one guaranteed request outward, choosing to spend it on a stranger. The gesture reframed the last meal as an act of charity at the edge of death. Prison officials denied the request. They would not divert a last meal to an outside party, citing the rules that govern the process. And so the pizza Workman asked for was never delivered to the homeless person he had imagined receiving it. But the denial did not end the story. News of Workman's request spread, and ordinary people responded by donating pizzas to homeless shelters in his name. What the state refused, the public carried out many times over, turning a single denied wish into a wave of giving. That ripple effect is what makes the case remarkable. A condemned man's final request, blocked by officials, ended up feeding far more hungry people than one pizza ever could have. The denial backfired into a movement of small kindnesses across several cities. The gesture also complicated the public image of Workman himself. Here was a man convicted of killing a police officer, using his last request to help the poor. For many, the act suggested remorse or a search for meaning, a final attempt to leave something good behind. For others, the generosity felt performative, a bid for sympathy timed to his execution. Yet the charitable response it inspired was real, regardless of his motives, and it gave his final hours a strange afterlife in the acts of strangers who never knew him. The tension in the case is the tension of the whole tradition. Should a man who took a life be allowed a final act of giving? And does the system serve anyone by refusing it? Workman's denied pizza forced those questions into the open. He was executed by lethal injection on May 9, 2007, maintaining doubts about his guilt to the end. The pizza he asked for never reached the person he intended, but the shelters that filled with donations in his name became his strange, unintended legacy. The next man's final request also became a turning point, though for reasons far removed from charity. His gesture was not generous but casual, a shared drink with the very official overseeing his death that scandalized the public and rewrote the rules for an entire state's executions. John Arthur Spenkelink makes this list for a gesture that blurred the line between condemned man and captor, and for the lasting policy change that gesture provoked. His final request was less about eating than about a strange moment of shared humanity before death. Spenkelink holds a grim historical distinction. He was the first person executed in Florida after the Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment in 1976, making his death a closely watched event that would help define how the state handled its return to the electric chair. For his final request, Spenkelink is remembered for sharing a flask of Jack Daniel's whiskey with the prison superintendent. The image of a condemned man and the official overseeing his execution drinking together struck the public as bizarre and, to many, deeply inappropriate. The strangeness is in the intimacy. A last meal is usually a solitary indulgence, but Spenkelink turned his into a shared act with the very man responsible for carrying out his sentence. The gesture collapsed the expected distance between prisoner and authority in a single drink. Reactions were sharply divided. Some saw a moment of grace, two men acknowledging the awful thing about to happen with a quiet, human ritual. Others saw an outrage, an official sharing liquor with a convicted murderer in the hours before killing him. The public backlash was significant. The shared whiskey came to symbolize a system that seemed too casual about the gravity of execution, and it fed a growing unease about how these final hours were being managed behind prison walls. That unease produced concrete change. In the wake of the controversy, Florida revised its rules around last meals, banning alcohol outright and imposing limits such as a modest cost cap and a requirement that food be purchased locally. One shared flask reshaped state policy. The reform reflected a broader anxiety about optics. Officials did not want images of condemned men enjoying liquor or lavish spreads, and Spenkelink's case became the catalyst for tightening a tradition that had operated with little formal restriction until then. The whiskey also carried the weight of his moment in history. As the first man to die in Florida's reinstated system, everything about Spenkelink's execution set precedents, and his final drink ensured that even the last meal ritual would be governed by new, stricter rules going forward. There is a human core beneath the controversy. Spenkelink faced the electric chair knowing he was a test case, a symbol of a resumed practice, and the shared drink may have been a way to find one moment of ordinary connection before an extraordinary death. He was executed by electrocution on May 25, 1979. The flask he shared outlived him as the origin point of Florida's alcohol ban, a strange legacy for a man whose final request was less a meal than a gesture toward the person about to end his life. The next case abandons policy and controversy for something quieter and far more heartbreaking. It centers on a man whose mind had been so damaged that his final act with his meal revealed, in one small gesture, just how little he understood about what was happening to him. Ricky Ray Rector belongs on this list for a single, devastating detail that turned his last meal into one of the most cited moments in the debate over capital punishment. What he did with his dessert revealed the depth of his impairment more starkly than any argument could. Rector was convicted of 2 murders in Arkansas, but the crucial fact of his case came after the killings. During his arrest, he shot himself in the head, destroying much of the front of his brain in what amounted to a self-inflicted lobotomy. That left him severely cognitively disabled. For his final meal, Rector requested steak, fried chicken, cherry Kool-Aid, and pecan pie. He ate most of it, but he did not touch the pie. When guards asked why, he told them he was saving it for later, as if a later would come. That single phrase is what makes the case unforgettable. A man hours from execution set his dessert aside for a future he could not comprehend was ending. The gesture laid bare a mind that could not grasp the finality of what was about to happen to him. The detail became a symbol in the fight over executing the intellectually disabled. If Rector genuinely believed he would eat that pie after his execution, then he lacked any real understanding of his own death, raising profound questions about the justice of putting him to death at all. His impairment was not in dispute. The self-inflicted brain damage had left him childlike and confused, and accounts describe him behaving in ways that showed little awareness of his situation. The saved pie was simply the clearest, most human illustration of that confusion. The timing sharpened the controversy. Rector's execution took place in January 1992, a full decade before the Supreme Court would bar the execution of the intellectually disabled. His death came at a moment when the law still permitted what many now consider indefensible. Politics haunted the case as well. The governor who declined to stop the execution, Bill Clinton, left the presidential campaign trail to return to Arkansas and preside over the decision, a move critics saw as calculated toughness on crime at a vulnerable man's expense. The image of a brain-damaged man saving his pie, while a future president let his execution proceed, became a lasting emblem for opponents of the death penalty. Few details on this list carry as much political and moral weight as that untouched slice. The pie also reframes what a last meal can reveal. For most inmates, the meal reflects preference or protest. For Rector, it accidentally exposed the state of his mind, offering evidence of incapacity through a simple, thoughtless act of setting dessert aside. Rector was executed by lethal injection on January 24, 1992, after prison staff struggled for nearly an hour to find a usable vein. The saved pie remained in his cell, a small, heartbreaking artifact of a man who never understood he would not return to finish it. The next case moves from a man who could not grasp his death to a man who understood his fully and used his final meal as a grand, deliberate gesture. His enormous order went completely untouched, and that refusal to eat would end a decades-old tradition across an entire state. Lawrence Russell Brewer holds a unique place on this list because his last meal did not just shock the public, it permanently changed the law. His enormous, untouched feast became the direct cause of Texas abolishing special last meal requests altogether. Brewer was one of the men convicted in the 1998 dragging murder of James Byatt Jr., a black man chained to a truck and dragged to his death in one of the most notorious hate crimes in modern American history. The savagery of the crime defined the case. For his final meal, Brewer ordered an astonishing spread, then refused to eat a single bite of it. He requested a feast and left it entirely untouched, telling officials simply that he was not hungry after all the food had been prepared and delivered. The order itself was staggering. Brewer asked for 2 chicken fried steaks with gravy and onions, a triple meat bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet with beef and jalapenos, a large bowl of fried okra, a pound of barbecue with bread, 3 fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, and more. He topped it with a pint of Blue Bell ice cream, a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts, and 3 root beers. The kitchen prepared all of it, a mountain of food assembled to his exact specifications, and set it before him in his final hours. Then Brewer refused it. He announced that he was not hungry and declined to eat, leaving the entire elaborate meal to sit uneaten. The waste, paired with the brutality of his crime, ignited immediate and furious public reaction. The outrage was swift and political. A Texas state senator, appalled that a man who had committed such a heinous murder could command an elaborate meal and then throw it away, demanded that the practice end. He threatened action if the prison system did not comply. The response was decisive. Within a day, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice abolished special last meal requests entirely. From that point on, condemned inmates in Texas would receive only the same standard meal served to the rest of the unit, with no special orders permitted. One man's decision not to eat had ended a tradition that stretched back decades in the nation's most active death penalty state. The story spread rapidly, and it remains one of the most cited facts about last meals anywhere online. Interpretations of the refusal vary. Some saw a final act of contempt, Brewer wasting resources as a last spiteful gesture. Others suspected he never intended to eat, ordering the feast purely to make a point, or simply because he could, knowing the food would go untouched. Brewer was executed by lethal injection on September 21, 2011, unrepentant to the end about the murder that had defined him. The uneaten feast outlived him as the single most consequential last meal in American history, the order that quietly killed the tradition itself in Texas. The final 2 entries strip away all excess and return to the smallest, strangest requests of all. Where Brewer ordered a banquet and ate nothing, the next man ordered almost nothing at all, a single tiny item that he hoped would outlast him in a way food never could. Victor Harry Feger earns the second spot for a request so minimal and so poetic that it has become one of the most famous last meals ever recorded. He asked for a single olive, and the meaning he attached to it has haunted observers ever since. Feger was convicted in a federal case for kidnapping and murdering a doctor in Iowa, having lured the physician with a fake emergency call before killing him. His crime was calculated and cold, which makes the gentleness of his final request all the more striking. For his last meal, Feger requested a single olive with the pit still inside. Not a plate, not a feast, not a childhood comfort food. One olive chosen for a specific and deliberate reason. That transformed a tiny piece of fruit into a final statement of hope. He explained the choice to the guards. Feger said he hoped that an olive tree, a symbol of peace, might one day grow from his grave, sprouting from the pit he intended to carry with him. The single olive was meant to become a living monument to peace. The symbolism is what elevates the request above mere strangeness into something profound. An olive branch has represented peace for millennia, and Feger, a convicted killer, reached for that ancient image in his final hours, expressing a wish for something to grow out of his death. There is a quiet redemption in the gesture, or at least a longing for it. Whatever drove his crime, Feger's last act was to imagine peace taking root where he was buried, a hope for beauty rising from the ground that would hold a condemned man's body. The most haunting detail came after the execution. Feger was hanged on March 15, 1963, and afterward, the olive pit was found in the pocket of his suit. He had kept it with him, carrying his small symbol of peace to the gallows and into death itself. That single pit, tucked in his pocket, turns the whole story into something almost unbearable. He had not eaten the olive carelessly. He had held onto its seed, honoring his own strange wish to the very end, hoping it might yet fulfill the purpose he imagined for it. His execution carried historical weight, too. Feger was the last person executed in Iowa before the state effectively abolished the death penalty, making his olive not only a personal symbol, but a quiet marker at the end of an era in that state's history. The request has become a touchstone in discussions of last meals precisely because it defies the pattern. Amid the feasts, the refusals, and the complaints, Feger's olive stands alone as an act of pure symbolism, a single small fruit carrying an enormous weight of meaning. People return to it because it complicates easy judgment. It is difficult to hold only contempt for a man whose final wish was that peace might grow from his grave. And that difficulty is exactly what makes the olive so enduring and so quietly devastating. And yet, for all its poetry, Feger's olive was still, at its heart, a piece of food. The final entry on this list crosses a line that no other request does. The number one strangest last meal was not food at all, and the man who asked for it left behind a warning meant to outlast everyone who denied him. James Edward Smith takes the number one spot because his final request was not a meal in any sense of the word. Where every other inmate on this list asked for something to eat or drink, or refused food outright, Smith asked for something the prison could not classify as food at all. Smith was convicted of capital murder in Texas for shooting a life insurance manager during a robbery. But it is not the crime that sets his case apart. It is what he asked for in his final hours, a request rooted in spiritual belief rather than appetite. Smith requested a lump of dirt, which he called Riakunda dirt, to be used in a voodoo ritual. He believed the dirt would aid his reincarnation and prevent his spirit from becoming a lost, wandering ghost after his death. The meal was to be an instrument of the afterlife. The strangeness is total. A last meal is meant to nourish or comfort, but Smith wanted his to serve a ritual purpose, treating the moment not as a final indulgence, but as a spiritual passage. He sought to shape what happened to his soul once the execution was done. Prison officials denied the request. They ruled that dirt was not food and was unsanitary, refusing to provide it on those grounds. In its place, they offered him a container of plain yogurt, an ordinary substitute for a request that was anything but ordinary. The substitution is almost surreal. A man asking for sacred dirt to guide his reincarnation was handed a cup of yogurt instead. The mundane colliding with the mystical. The mismatch captures the gulf between Smith's spiritual intentions and the rigid, practical rules of the execution chamber. Smith did not accept the denial quietly. According to accounts, he warned officials that he would haunt the prison for 300 years, turning his refused request into a curse. The threat transformed his final hours from a plea into a defiant promise of vengeance from beyond death. That warning is what seals his place at the top of this list. It is one thing to make a strange request. It is another to respond to its denial by vowing to haunt your executioners for 3 centuries, weaponizing your own death against the institution taking your life. The blend of faith, desperation, and defiance in Smith's final act is unlike anything else on this countdown. He used his last request not to comfort himself, but to prepare his spirit, and when refused, he used his last breath to threaten the living. The case exposes a deeper tension in how prisons handle belief. Smith's request was denied as unsanitary and not food, but it was also, at its root, a religious and cultural practice. The refusal raised questions about whether the condemned have any right to spiritual accommodation at the end. Smith was executed by lethal injection on June 26, 1990. His request for sacred dirt unfulfilled, and his cup of yogurt, a poor stand-in for the ritual he wanted. Whether or not his spirit lingered, his story certainly has, retold endlessly as the strangest last meal request ever recorded. From a single olive meant to grow into peace, to a lump of dirt meant to guide a soul. These 20 requests reveal how the condemned face their final hours in wildly different ways. Some cling to comfort, some to protest, some to faith, and